I came across an article during the research I performed for my Did Syd and Pink Floyd the Beatles miniseries regarding the song Something, written by George Harrison and the Beatles. And in that article by the Financial Times, and I'll give a link to it in my description, they discuss Mr. Sinatra's opinion that Something is the greatest love song of the past 50 years. And when I read that, I thought to myself, that's interesting. I need to do a little bit of a talk about this because it's upsetting to me for a few reasons. The article is well written and discusses some aspects of the song, and I'll go into the lyrics themselves a little bit later. One of the things that they note is that the many people that have sung it repeatedly over the years have done so in a way that doesn't really seem to be capturing the frailty of Mr. Harrison, and they're losing an aspect to the song that tends to make it a really strong love song. Now, I've chosen the word strong there, in spite of frailty, because that's intrinsic to the nature of love for people that are wise to the ways of love. And one of the reasons this is so disturbing to me is because words are important, and the fact that Mr. Sinatra would say that it's the greatest love song, as if greatness has something to do with love, is absurd. It would be like discussing the strongest paper dollar that you ever owned. Words can matter. The idea that there is greatness tied within love and not beauty is something that is a little bit disturbing to me. And of course, people that have voices and use them should be careful with their word choices. Otherwise, other folks will hear what they have to say and be impressed by it. Now, this distinction of words might seem like a small thing, but this is exactly what Hemingway meant when he discussed the idea that there are only three sports and everything else is just a game. There's a reason why we call the Olympics the Olympic Games, because they are just games. They are not what Hemingway would consider to be sports, because they are not dedicated, committed, and sacrificial. In other words, the people involved with him do not face the possibility of a fairly probable death in their trial and tribulation that's associated with their sport. In many ways, it really is just a game. It requires a lot of dedication and work, but the certainty that you're going to go home at the end of the day is kind of tied to the modern idea of games, which are very frequently called sport, but are actually just games. In this way, a person can discuss, I suppose, the greatness of love itself, but the idea of ranking loves is a bit absurd. Now, every love song is beautiful in many ways. You'd have to write a very, very terrible love song for it for it to actually not contain beauty. I think you would actually have to work at it for it not to contain beauty. The amount of beauty within a love song or within the sentiment of being in love can vary, but ideally, I would say that the sentiment of love itself quite often is something that's going to contain an indeterminate amount of beauty within it, and for that reason they're all quite valuable. Now, what I would like to do in this video is discuss a number of poems that are associated with the idea of love and kind of think about what they might be relaying and what we can learn from them. Then I want to look at the lyrics for the song Something. And then I'm going to play for you the song that I consider to be the most beautiful love song I've ever heard. And I'll discuss that love song. And then I'll discuss one last song by Sting. So let's go ahead then and get started. And what I would like to do is show you a poem by Mr. Robert Herrick. Its title is Delight in Disorder. And I'll just kind of read it to you as I have it up here on the screen. A sweet disorder in the dress kindles in clothes a wantonness, a lawn about the shoulders thrown into a fine distraction, an erring lace which here and there enthralls the crimson stomacher, a cuff neglectful and thereby ribands to flow confusedly, a winning wave deserving note in the tempestuous petticoat, a careless shoestring in whose tie I see a wild civility, do more bewitch me than when art is too precise in every part. So let's go ahead then and consider the nature of this poem. The first is the significant amount of alliteration, S and D in the first line. It continues on, sweet disorder in the dress, and kindles in clothes of wantonness. But more importantly, in my opinion, are the ideas within this poem that something that is out of place or not carefully practiced can be a signal to what is termed to be wild civility. And in many ways, I think it captures very accurately something that is tied to the idea of love, and that is that it is not controlled. It is wild. It is civil. It is actually highly civilizing, but it is also wild. It is tied within our innate nature to love and to be loved. So it is not something that is entirely controllable. And in many ways, noting something a little bit different about someone else is also a way of noticing their uniqueness. It makes them, in many ways, more attractive because they are unique. In the same way that we all hope to also be unique and, in a way, more defined as individuals. In that way, we can respect one another more, as we have noted the value that is tied with uniqueness. There's a lot more that's going on in this poem, but as a starter, let's just kind of consider that poem and move on now. And there's one more thing I want to point out about this poem, and that Mr. Herrick, of course, is a man, and if you'll notice, almost the entirety of this poem is discussing the way that someone looks. Now, many people have commented that men are quite visual, and I will say, I suppose, for the average man that can be true. Men can fixate on things visually. But I just want to point out that when you get into discussions about color blindness, that's largely a male trait. So, I mean, you can argue things however you like, but in my mind, men and women are remarkably similar in many ways. And of course, there are individuals that are totally different than any expectations you might have of what is a man and what is a woman. So each person should be treated with a unique set of, let's say, learned expectations. So we go into any kind of relationship thinking perhaps that we might know things about people, but over time we'll find that each person is quite different from what general statements might be in their own ways. Let's move on. And that recognition really is a wonderful part of the process of being in love. Now, the next poem that I would like to show you is one by Miss Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was, of course, a lady. And she wrote a poem, Sonnet 14, titled If Thou Must Love Me. So let's take a look at that. If thou must love me, let it be for naught except for love's sake only. Do not say I love her for her smile, her look, her way of speaking gently, for a trick of thought that falls in well with mine, and certes brought a sense of pleasant ease on such a day. For these things in themselves, beloved, may be changed, or changed for thee, and love so wrought may be unwrought so. Neither love me for thine own dear pities wiping my cheeks dry. A creature might forget to weep who bore thy comfort long, and lose thy love thereby. But love me for love's sake, that evermore thou mayest love on, through love's eternity. Now this poem has a kind of a interesting structure to it, as you can tell from the reading. It flows from line to line, often without break, but there are rhymes embedded at end of line, and how it's all set up I don't know entirely, but not, thought, brought, wrought, evermore, bore, for. So you can see that she is rhyming. How it's all set up, I don't really want to get into that too much. There is not a whole lot of alliteration happening here, nor is there metaphor. What there is within this poem that I really enjoy about this poem is the very simple statement that you shouldn't love people for tricks or for what is being shown. Love is tied only to the idea that a person actually recognizes that they're in love. Love me for love's sake, that evermore thou mayest love on through love's eternity. The recognition of the eternal sentiment is an entirely internal one, and while people may speak it to one another, it's never known to be completely true by the person receiving the message, if it is actually delivered. It can only be recognized by the person that is feeling that emotion. And in my opinion, anyone who recognizes that emotion needs to understand the value of it, because it's not something that happens very often. And if you're lucky, it'll happen perhaps once or twice during the course of your life, perhaps 3 times. So the idea that many people have that they will simply go out into the world and find another lover if they are feeling this sentiment and they are careless with it is a mistaken sentiment. A person should be honest with themselves and honest with the other person if they are feeling that way. And unfortunately, in many cases, someone may feel this way and not have the feeling reciprocated, or not genuinely have the feeling reciprocated. A little bit, I guess you could say, unfortunate. But certainly, if people are young and they recognize this in one another, they must, in my opinion, be very honest with one another and with themselves of the implication of that, because that is not something that's going to go away easily. Let's move on to the next poem. The next poem is by Shakespeare. It's Sonnet 130. Its title, I guess you could say title, is My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. And this is one of the lines from a Sting song. And I can't remember the title of the Sting song offhand right now, but let's look at the poem or the sonnet and see what he has to say. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress when she walks treads on the ground. And yet by heaven I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. So I'm including this, of course, because many people think that love being beautiful means that a person needs to be physically beautiful forever. And Shakespeare is attacking that very sentiment in this poem. When love is recognized, as Miss Barrett has pointed out in her poem, it is eternal. And though our bodies will over time become aged and lose beauty, the sentiment remains. That eternity of love is something that I think is perhaps its most beautiful aspect. Let's look a little bit closer at a number of things within Mr. Shakespeare's sonnet. The second line, coral is far more red than her lips red. Obviously, coral is not red. The color coral is kind of a pink. So, in that line, he's saying that her lips not only are not red, they're less red than pink. So, that would be considered something that is even less beautiful than something that is already fading in color. The next line, if snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. And if you're not familiar with dun, that doesn't have anything to do with dung. Dun is a color. It's kind of a gray. It's kind of a gray color. So he's saying that she does not have white skin. She has kind of gray skin. Gray is associated with aging, of course. But the standard for beauty at that time was to have light white skin, because that was tied to being rich, essentially. You wouldn't have to work outside, so you would have light colored skin. Roses damasked, that line, I have seen roses damasked. Now that's a pattern in cloth. So I'll show you kind of what the pattern looks like here. But no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that for my mistress reeks. So her breath don't smell too great. And he notes that music has a far more pleasing sound than her voice when she speaks. Another truth about many occasions. As an aside here, I just want to point out one of the things that I've noted about people over time is that I forget what they sound like quite quickly. I can remember their faces and I can remember things they say, but I can't remember the sound of their voice. And it's a little bit disconcerting to think that the sound of someone's voice goes very quickly. Now, if someone was to sing a song, I can still hear their voice in the song. So perhaps there's something to the idea of singing to your children. If you are so inclined, it I think will help your children to remember you. There's something about songs that connect people with one another, and there's something about the memory of a voice that carries better in my mind when I can hear it in a song. But if it's just a conversation, it's gone the next day. I can't remember what they sounded like. Let's move on to the next poem that I would like to read you. I don't want to get too hung up on these kind of side ideas. Another poem by Robert Herrick. So let's take a look at it. To the virgins to make much of time. This is kind of a famous poem by Mr. Herrick. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worse, time still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while you may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. This poem, just overall, my thoughts, is capturing some of the warning, the negative side of missing out on beauty in life. So let's look at it a little bit closer. Gather ye rosebuds while you may, old time is still a-flying. Now, in my Did Syd and Peeling Syd series, I discussed the idea of time flying and clocks turning. That's something that comes up quite frequently in Syd Barrett's music and also in Pink Floyd's music. It's here. This same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. We all have relatively short lives. We only have so much time on this world to experience it. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. These two ideas of the sun setting and time being tied to a race, these are within Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, these same ideas. And of course these are old ideas that the sun has cycles and we each have our own life, and that life is a cycle. Two Suns in the Sunset is another song that is by Pink Floyd that kind of discusses this same idea. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worse, time still succeed the former. This ties into the idea of youth and beauty and love all being tied together, not least of which is because as people age, they grow colder in personality and outlook, but also biologically they grow colder. And of course also as a person ages they begin to have pain, and that may seem like a small thing until you get a little bit older and you realize that being in pain can kind of worsen your outlook about the world in general. So the idea of youth being beautiful and the ideal of love may have more to it than simply the emotion of love. It may also, and we'll discuss this in a moment, tie in with a much greater idea of love, and for that reason perhaps would explain why the Greeks idealized the youth of love. Let's move on to the very last part of that poem. Be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go merry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Tarry means linger, or just kind of sit and do nothing. So that last bit of advice to youth, to use their time, is, I guess people could take that in a couple of ways, but I'm a little bit disturbed at modern society because I feel like it has taught generations of children that they should wait to fall in love and marry. And the reason for that is largely financial. It's almost entirely financial, that a person needs to be financially stable before they allow themselves to fall in love and get married. The implication is, of course, that if children come when a couple is not financially capable, then they won't be able to raise them properly. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps things have gotten to the point where it's so difficult now to raise children financially that many people are kind of reluctant to do so. But I think looking back on life now and looking at the situation of many people, this idea that you can time something like love and capture and predict the wild civility of love is a very unfortunate and misguided sentiment. A person can meet someone at any point in time in their life and recognize that they have fallen in love. And however that occurs to happen. Now, not every couple wants to have kids or will have kids, so the financial aspect of that is not quite so limiting to them. But even if you do want to eventually have a family, and this is something that was always important to me, the idea of financial limitations can be quite restricting to some people. Now, when I was young, I was on my own. I didn't have a lot of money. And so this was something that came up quite often in my experience. And the idea that a person needs to be financially successful before they can actually have children, I think is something that is stealing time and beauty from people's lives. It's unfortunate that people honestly believe so frequently that they have to wait to fall in love, and they eventually become financially stable at, 30, 35 years old. But by that point in time, quite often, They've lost the real joy of youthful love, which is a little bit, I guess you could say, um, it is unfortunate. So let's look at the song Something, and I wanted to let's see if we can see things in there that are similar to these poems. And unfortunately, of course, these lyrics are still under copyright, so I can't just throw all of the lyrics up there. I'll just kind of mention things as they come to me. Now, one of my favorite things before I start with this song is actually George Harrison's voice. He has kind of a weak voice. It's frail. It has frailty in it. And for that reason, I like the song more, because frailty, or the acknowledgement of danger, is tied to the idea of youthful love, the idea that something is beyond control, that could very much hurt someone, is captured in his voice. The uncertainty of it and how to navigate it is captured in his voice. So many people have sung this song, and they sing it very powerfully, as if they're singing a great love song and not a beautiful love song. So let's take a look at the lyrics themselves. Something in the way she moves. Right there, we have alliteration. It's quite significant. Something she moves. S and M's. Attracts me like no other lover. There's a moves and a lover, both with the V sound. We also have some L alliteration, like lover. Something in the way she woos me. Now there's a me that's added on there after the moves and woos rhyme. A little bit of odd tempo change that is attractive. A little bit of wild civility, perhaps. Don't want to leave her now. You know I believe in how. So now and how are the rhyme. Now, if you'll notice, again here is the idea that's captured, that there's something a little bit off about this person that can't be really stated in words. It's just something in the way that she's moving that's attracting this individual. This is written by a male. I assume he's a heterosexual male. I'm not aware of any of the Beatles declaring themselves to be anything outside of a heterosexual male. And notice again, all of this is visual. Okay, so there's an internal process that's noted, the attraction, but it's tied to the way someone is moving. Okay, so let's look at the next line, or the next verse. Something in her smile she knows. So there again is the S, something in smile. So there's S and M's, not S and M, but the letters S and M here. She knows. I don't need no other lover. Something in her style that shows me. So there again is that odd me, the odd tempo that makes this quite attractive. It's a little bit of wild civility. I don't want to leave her now, you know I believe in how. Notice again, this verse is visual. Something in her smile, and she knows that I don't need no other lover. Something in her style. Very similar to Robert Herrick's poem, Sweet Disorder, or Delight in Disorder. Now the next portion of the song is perhaps my favorite. You're asking me, will my love grow? I don't know, I don't know. This is the chorus. You stick around and it may show. I don't know, I don't know. Now, the reason I really love this is because it's an indication of inexperience. And of course, youthful inexperience, as we just mentioned, is tied to what I suppose would be considered by many to be either a foolish form of love, an absolute form of love, or even a truer form of love. So that inexperience and youth can be a part of a process that generates a much stronger feeling or a much stronger sensation of love between people. So the uncertainty of the individual in this statement, I don't know. I don't know. And it's repeated for effect to indicate that the person really doesn't know entirely what they're doing or what they're feeling. They just recognize that they have the sensation of love. Let's look at the last verse. Something in the way she knows. All I have to do is think of her, something in the things she shows me. So there again is that odd me. Don't want to leave her now, you know I believe in how. And then they get back to the chorus again. So that mental process that's kind of mentioned there, something about the way that she knows, and I just have to think about her. So that mental process of thought and a mental connection between the two individuals is an important part of that process for mutual consideration and love. So, a wonderful song, a beautiful song, but the greatest love song? No. Why would someone have to rate something as being great? It captures beauty, and it beautifully does so. Now, I actually made this video previously around Valentine's Day. I was going to release it earlier, but I didn't like what I made, so I have redone it. And then my guitar string broke, so I couldn't play the song. But I did record what I had that day, and it's acceptable. So I will attempt to play for you here what I consider to be the most beautiful, the most complete love song I've ever heard. Its title is Green is the Color. It's from the More album by Pink Floyd, and I'll play it for you here. Heavy hung the canopy of blue, shade my eyes and I can see you. White was the light that shined through the dress that she wore. She lived in the shadow of the waves. Hazy were the visions of her play. Sunlight on her eyes, but moonshine made her blind every time. Green is the color of her kind. Quickness of the eye deceives the mind. The bond between the hopeful and the damned. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed the song, and I tried to convey some of the beauty that I felt connected to that song, and hopefully I was able to capture it and deliver it in a way that expressed it so that other people will be able to recognize the beauty in the song as well. Now, the reason I'm doing this is for a couple of reasons. The first is that very, very few people know this song. I would wager that like 95% of people that like music, and perhaps even people that like Pink Floyd, won't know this song, and it's really a shame. It is an entirely beautiful song, and within it are captured some really wonderful ideas. Which brings me to the second point that I want to make about this song. Not only that it's beautiful and more people need to recognize it, but that it is expressing ideas that completely capture the beauty of love in a very, very, I guess you could say, understandable way. So let's take a look at the beautiful things happening within this song. the many expressions within this song, the beautiful poetry of this song, the masterful poetry of this song, and then finally the sentiments that it leaves us with when it's finished. So let's look at the very first line. Heavy hung the canopy of blue. Now, if you that hits me really hard immediately. That is a beautiful line, and I'm going to break it down a little. If you notice right away, heavy hung is is using H alliteration, but it also is tied with a possible metaphor, a male metaphor, a slang metaphor for male biology. Heavy hung the canopy of blue. Now, one of the interesting things that happens to me when I say these lines is the H's early in the sentence draw me into saying things with more H's. So now when I say canopy of blue, I actually find myself making those more, I guess you could say, accentuating the H sounds within those words. Canopy of blue. Now, each one of those three words can have an H in it, depending upon how you pronounce it. When you read this whole line, see if you do the same thing. Compare that with See Through Baby Blue, which is a lyric by Mr. Barrett in the song Arnold Lane. When you say See Through Baby Blue, do you exhale with an H? I don't. So why do I exhale with an H on canopy of blue in this line? Perhaps that's just me, but it's a little bit odd. It's almost like the heavy hung portion of the first line is keying you to exhale on those other words. It is interesting to me, of course, that those words also have H's embedded in them that wouldn't be recognized, which is extensive alliteration. The other thing that I want to point out is that we also have canopy of blue, so we also have the P and the B form of alliteration. P and B are very similar in the mouth, so that is a form of alliteration that we have noted that Mr. Barrett likes to use. Perhaps some other people do as well. Now, this song is supposedly attributed to being written by Mr. Waters, I believe, and probably Mr. Gilmore put together the guitar parts. The guitar portion is it's wonderfully put together. So let's take a look at the next line. Shade my eyes and I can see you. Look at all the S alliteration there. Shade, eyes, see. Now this also is giving the impression of what someone is seeing directly from their point of view. Let's continue with the last line of this first verse. White is the light that shines through the dress that you wore. What a beautiful image in a person's mind. It's incredibly attractive, it's incredibly beautiful, and it's also capturing, again, from what we assume to be a male point of view, the idea of seeing white light shining through someone's dress, which is physically attractive, but also, if you understand the nature of symbolism, you'll recognize the importance of white light tied to women. Now, in the Western tradition, of course, women wear white for their weddings, and there's a reason that they wear white for their weddings. Not just because it's tied to some idea of purity and cleanliness, but also because it ties in with intent. What are the intents of the individuals that are being married? White is traditionally also tied to the idea of heaven. I don't know if that's because of the clouds of the sky or whatever, but it's tied to this higher ideal or this sentiment of devotion and sacrifice for another person. And that, of course, is distinctly tied to a committed concept of what love is. So, we have a number of ideas there. Again, notice all of the visual clues. The white light shading eyes so that they can see someone, and heavy hung the canopy of blue. Now, we have within the first line there an identification of possible male, and perhaps a recognition of a male sentiment, in that the person that is writing this, the author of the song, is discussing the idea of being heavy hung, and of course not judging it as being good or evil, but simply recognizing it as an indicator of physical attraction, which is a very artistic thing to do, in my opinion. A very spiritual and artistic thing to do. Notice that there are two colors mentioned here. I will get back to this later, blue and white. Okay? Just notice this is blue and white, and this first verse is tied to the ideas of physical attraction and purity of intent. Okay, so let's move to the next verse. She lay in the shadow of the wave. So we have an internal rhyme set there, lay and wave. Shadow and wave both have the W sound, but also the SH, she, shadow, alliteration. Why is she laying in the shadow of the waves? Not entirely certain, but of course the ocean is intrinsically tied to female. We have an identifier here of female, so now perhaps we are looking at things from a female point of view, perhaps. I will also point out that the wave form is a curve, and of course curves are often associated with the female form. So the idea that there is a shadow of a wave could be referring again to portions of female anatomy. So she is laying in the shadow of the wave. The waves, of course, are tied to wind and the ocean. The ocean is, of course, tied to female because of the cycles of the moon and the tides and the cycles of women. So historically speaking, the ocean often is used as a metaphor, a symbolic metaphor for female. Hazy were the visions of her playing. So we have the long A sound there. Hazy, playing. Sunlight on her eyes, but moonshine made her blind every time. What all could that possibly mean? I don't know. But the idea of sunlight being on someone's eyes could be something that is helping them to see things clearly, but moonshine is making them blind. And as we just mentioned, the moon is tied to the ocean, and that is tied to the idea of, I suppose you could say, what makes a person a little bit wildly civil. Human and animal, not plant. Under control, but not entirely under control. A bit of delight in disorder, perhaps. So let's look at the last verse. Green is the color of her kind. Okay. Now, I just want to point out the G and the hard K sound are alliteration. They're very similar, and when you form them, they're in the back of the throat. G and K. They're formed in your throat. So that is alliteration. Green color kind. Okay, why is her kind green? Let's find out. Quickness of the eye deceives the mind. The next line. Envy is the bond between the hopeful and the damned. Now, we've just gone from absolute purity in the first verse to being tied to the physical form and physical love and the physical drive of love in the second verse, to now the third. The idea of perhaps a negative aspect that is either hindering love or is a part of love, which is the idea of envy. Envy tied within love. How can envy be the bond between the hopeful and the damned? Well, in my mind, envy is tied to the conversion from hope and damnation, particularly as it comes to love. Because when people allow other considerations outside of the sensation and the general well-being and intent and devotion and sacrifice tied to love to enter into their mind, they move from hopeful to damned, or into a life that possibly will be lacking love, and instead becomes concerned with possessions and with jealousies and with the desire for securities that are beyond what I suppose many people would consider necessary. Now, if you notice, we just mentioned green. And if you notice in the very first verse, we mentioned white and blue. Now, if you are a Syd Barrett or a Pink Floyd fan, and you are familiar with the Dark Side of Oz theory, I want to point out to you, right here in this song, are the concepts of white and blue versus green. And that is in The Wizard of Oz. Now, if you watch our Did Syd Dark Side of Oz episode, you'll be familiar with this already. I just am pointing this out here because here is an earlier version of the same idea. And if you're an artist, you know that quite frequently artists will revisit ideas and make them perfect them over time, I suppose you could say. But here, very clearly stated, are the ideas of white and blue versus green. And white and blue, of course, is the color of Dorothy's dress, and she is the ideal female that is coming into her feminine power. And green is the color of the witch, who desires the pinnacle of femininity that Dorothy possesses, and for that reason, she is not only the villain of the film and the story, but also betrays the source of her own depravity, which is an absence of love and caring and sacrifice and dedication for the desire of envy that is quoted in this song. Now, one of the things I want to kind of lay out for you is that there are many, many ways to express love. But the more aspects or the more angles, the more ways of viewing it that are captured within an expression, in my opinion, make it more complete. Not entirely more beautiful. A beautiful poem, a beautiful love poem can be very short. But it certainly can be more complete. So, how can a love poem or a love song be more complete? Well, is it looking at things from a person's point of view, a singular person's point of view, regarding themselves? Are they evaluating themselves and how they feel? This song is in the first verse. Are they reviewing the other person and what they may be feeling as well? The second verse certainly does do that. The third is, are they evaluating the overall situation and how they feel about it? In this poem, the setting itself is discussed. This idea of being by the ocean and the waves, and how everyone seems to kind of be tied in specifically or keyed in to the feeling of the ocean and the waves. And of course the ocean is recognized by many poets as being tied to the idea of being in love. And finally, do they have an overall appreciation for their situation in the world as a whole? And this person, the author of this song, doesn't really seem to get into that too much. But we can assume that they are happy with their place in the world as a general rule. Now, if they can kind of discuss all of those aspects within a singular song or poem, that makes it quite complete, in my opinion. It captures the entirety of the sensation of being content with love. And that is really a wonderful sensation. It doesn't happen very often. Now, the last thing that I want to point out to you is that there is no chorus. There is no chorus in this song. And really, a love song shouldn't have a chorus, in my opinion. In that way, it captures the idea that everything is new and original and unique. And every single line of this song is original and unique. And it captures that sensation as well. So that's really my thoughts on this song. I hope that you enjoyed that song, and I hope this kind of shows you another aspect to the idea of love. And although I do think Something really is a wonderful song, and it is a beautiful love song, I'll point you to this song, and I'll say, take a look at this and tell me that this isn't capturing something extraordinary. Whoever wrote this song, whoever wrote this song was a master not only of poetry and metaphor and symbolism, but also at, I can only assume, as a very young age, was masterfully understanding the totality of the sensation and dedication tied up within the idea of love. There is one more song that I'll point you to. I'm not going to run through it. It's by Sting. It's called The Secret Marriage. And if you like this song, The Green is the Color, I'll suggest you go take a look at the song The Secret Marriage. And I'll link it in the description. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will talk to you folks later.